Hello everyone, I'm Dr. Mark Henderson, and this is your first lecture for your first week of my English 206 World Lit 2 course. And we're going to be covering four main literary periods, literary cultures in, in World Lit 2. We're going to begin with the Enlightenment, then move on to Romanticism, then very quickly Realism, and then into, well, pretty much what we're still in, have been in since the early 20th century, and that is modernism. But let's begin here with the Enlightenment, its history, culture, and literature. The time span of the Enlightenment, now as with most historical cultural periods, the time span for the Enlightenment is debatable. It's something that over time you grasp by feel, really, more than anything else. Some say as early as the mid-17th century with Descartes, René Descartes, the I think, therefore I am philosopher, his cogito. And others say as late as the French Revolution in 1789, but average-wise, it's relatively agreed upon to be the early 18th century, the early 1700s. Now, the main tension that defines the debate going on during the Enlightenment is the ancients versus the moderns. Now, ancients versus moderns, if you apply that, say, if you're looking for some sort of parallel from that time to this time, the ancients, if you think about it, they preferred things to stay the way they are. So today that is what we would call conservatism. You're conservatives. Your moderns, on the other hand, are a little more embracing of the changing times, and they want progress. And, well, of course, today we associate that with liberalism and progressivism, your liberals and your progressives. But not exactly the same thing, but it's enough to kind of get your head around the concept of ancients versus moderns. The main cultural quarrel during the Enlightenment was between the so-called ancients and the so-called moderns, with both sides using reason, that was their common ground, as their guide. The Enlightenment, after all, refers to the gaining of illumination, the old light bulb above the head, by means of the power of the human mind, with a focus on individualism. Now, the ancients, again, their modern analog would be conservatives, they feared the possibility of the new focus on individualism, producing social alienation, unscrupulous self-seeking, and a lack of moral responsibility. In other words, in the extreme, the complete disavowal of traditional ideals and sort of a take-no-prisoners approach to progress at all costs. They fear that would produce some negative effects. The moderns, on the other hand, they, of course, were all about the revolution for change. Viva la revolution, so to speak. Moderns upheld the importance of individual autonomy, broad education for women, and intellectual and geographical exploration. Now, just in case here's an example of how you don't want to identify moderns necessarily with complete, the stereotypical view of liberalism today, because, well, the moderns, their pursuits had negative effects as well. Both had positives, both the ancients and the moderns had positive and negative effects in their beliefs. For instance, that geographical exploration based upon intellectual curiosity. An unfortunate offshoot of that result was, of course, colonialism, in which, from a position of Anglocentricity and what is usually white supremacy, a sense of European supremacy, you exploit and end up perpetrating various atrocities, sometimes genocide, upon indigenous peoples. People that you prejudicially see as, quote-unquote, savage. Now, Deism. Deism, if the Enlightenment certainly was a time of a shift in religious thought, or at least a shift in religious focus. Now, deism is the typical philosophical view of God that is associated with the Enlightenment. You've perhaps heard this before. It's the old metaphor of God as the watchmaker. What does a watchmaker do? They make the parts of the watch, they put the parts together, they set the watch in motion, and then they step back, and they just let it run. The model of God as the watchmaker, God, having created the universe, does not intervene. There is no divine intervention. Therefore, no need for prayer, because it's, well, God's design. It's God's will. God becomes depersonalized. The primacy of religion in society becomes diminished. There's more of a focus on, well, secular ways of thinking, philosophy, for instance. Social class and political conviction take over religion as primary issues of public problems and social turmoil, and it encouraged the separation of ethics from religion, or something to associate with the United States, separation of church and state. It is no accident that the founding of the United States is an Enlightenment event. A lot of the ideals behind the founding of the United States are very much Enlightenment ideals. Now, a result of the Enlightenment, and of course this is typical of any time of profound cultural change, change is scary. So society's reactionary, fearful need out of this change is order. Order. You're trying to hang on to as much as possible because you want something to be familiar. Too much change will discombobulate you. You'll feel like the rug is being pulled out from under you. Now, for instance, a guy named Thomas Hobbes, who you may have heard of. He wrote a very influential political book called Leviathan. And in it, he portrays mankind in an incredibly cynical and pessimistic way, but the influence of this outlook upon politics today is undeniable. Thomas Hobbes, according to him in the Leviathan, in the state of nature, in other words, in man's state of nature, in his heart of hearts, human life is inevitably nasty, mean, brutish, and short. In other words, people are just animals when you get down to it. Therefore, they must be rigidly structured and controlled. People need laws to whip them into line. Otherwise, well, they simply will not behave. You need elaborate social structures, but it was prejudicial towards it prejudiced the aristocracy. So therefore, this idea would become an apology, an excuse for the existence of the aristocracy. Both men and women accepted as necessary the subordination of women, even in the upper classes. Few opportunities for education and occupation outside the household for women. And from our modern standpoint, it's kind of easy to think, oh wow, what feminist zeros these women were, not to fight. But back then, of course, they didn't quite have the momentum of change, the momentum of precedent that we have today. Things were a lot scarier. There was no momentum. That's why those first feminist heroines are considered so brave. It takes a very special person to get the ball rolling whenever you have no momentum in your favor whatsoever. And of course, during such times, you very practically and very cynically just look towards the devil you know. And manners, one of the more comical symptoms of this reactionary, fearful need for order during the Enlightenment is the proliferation of etiquette books and this obsession, especially among the upper classes, with manners. Now, under manners, there is the discrepancy between reality and the social mask, the discrepancy between social appearance and private actuality. hiding behind superficial standards of behavior, putting on a public face. An obsession with social conventions or agreed-on systems of behavior declared appropriate for specific, often ludicrously specific, situations. Now, in terms of literature, the literary conventions, manners refers to agreed-on systems of verbal and stylistic behavior. Literature must both delight and instruct its readers. If often the saving grace of the bawdy satirical literature of this time is that it must ultimately provide some kind of moral. Otherwise, it would have been considered obscene. Now, an example is that in a lot of the drama, that is the plays written during the time of the Enlightenment, you have, and I think you will notice this in the first work we'll cover, Molière's Tartuffe, which is a play, there is the unity of time and place. The rule of drama of the unity of time and place, in which there is no change of scene, stage action occupies no more time than its representation. In other words, everything seems to occur in real time, with no leaps in distance or time. And both social and literary conventions were reactionary attempts to provide continuity between the present and the past, again because of fear of change. Now let's go to Tartuffe, shall we? This is the first literary work we're going to cover. And the purpose of these introductions is to help give you some kind of context before you do your homework, really, the quote-unquote quizzes, but really what they are is, all they are is that I ask you to go to the discussion board and I give you a short body of questions and I just ask you to respond to them in substantive but still brief form through your own individual response to the posting. And that is what I grade in terms of the discussion board percentage as outlined on the syllabus. And what I'm going to do is I will provide you each week the context for the work with this, going through these PowerPoint introductions here through these videos with you, and then you just respond as best you can to those discussion questions. I will often, after a period of time, say towards the end of that week, post my general comments in the form of an announcement based upon that week's literary work, and I will also sometimes, in fact quite often, respond to specific posts in the discussion board, just to kind of gauge where everybody is and steer everyone accordingly in the direction that I see fit. But I'll still keep an open mind in terms of other interpretations as well, of course. So, Tartuffe by Molière. Don't need that, do I? Next slide. Ah, yes. Now, when it comes to this biographical stuff, it's not necessarily something you always have to keep in mind with the work, but good to know. Jean-Baptiste Poquelin, with the addition of Molière. Molière is an addition. He is credited for reviving and affirming the importance and potency of comedy as a serious, flexible art form. In other words, comedy being a great means of treating very serious issues, hence satire, which I will get more into in a second. And this guy, oh wow, was he ever dedicated to drama. So dedicated to it that he died while doing it. He died in his 50s only a few hours after performing in a play of his own, The Imaginary Invalid. So he devoted his entire life to drama, both as a playwright and as an actor. Now a bit about this play, which has quite the history. Tartuffe means hypocrite or impostor. And in 1664, the play was banned from the public stage by Louis XIV, who nevertheless had it read aloud to various audiences in his own court, including high dignitaries of the church. So he secretly had no problem with it, but of course, some of the clergy who